The Democratic Party is one of the two major contemporary political parties in the United States. Since the 1850s, its main political rival has been the Republican Party. The two parties have since dominated American politics. The Democratic Party was founded in 1828. Martin Van Buren of New York played the central role in building the coalition of state organizations that formed a new party as a vehicle to elect Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. The Democratic Party is the world's oldest active political party. It initially supported expansive presidential power, the interests of slave states, agrarianism, and geographical expansionism, while opposing a national bank and high tariffs. It split in 1860 over slavery and won the presidency only twice between 1860 and 1912, although it won the popular vote 2 more times in that period. In the late 19th century, it continued to oppose high tariffs and had fierce internal debates on the gold standard. In the early 20th century, it supported progressive reforms and opposed imperialism, with Woodrow Wilson winning the White House in 1912 and 1916. Since Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president in 1932, the Democratic Party has promoted a liberal platform that includes support for Social Security and unemployment insurance. The New Deal attracted strong support for the party from recent European immigrants but diminished the party's pro-business wing. From late in Roosevelt's administration through the 1950s, a minority in the party's southern wing joined with conservative Republicans to slow and stop progressive domestic reforms. Following the Great Society era of progressive legislation under Lyndon B. Johnson, who was often able to overcome the conservative coalition in the 1960s, the core bases of the parties shifted, with the southern states becoming more reliably Republican and the northeastern states becoming more reliably Democratic. The party's labor union element has become smaller since the 1970s, and as the American electorate shifted in a more conservative direction following the presidency of Ronald Reagan, the election of Bill Clinton marked a move for the party toward the third way, moving the party's economic stance towards market-based economic policy. Barack Obama oversaw the party's passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2010. During Joe Biden's presidency, the party has adopted an increasingly progressive economic agenda. In the 21st century, the party is strongest among urban voters, union workers, college graduates, women, African Americans, sexual minorities, religious minorities, and the unmarried. On social issues, it advocates for abortion rights, voting rights, LGBT rights, action on climate change, immigration reform, and the legalization of marijuana. On economic issues, the party favors health care reform, universal child care, paid sick leave, and supporting unions. In foreign policy, the party supports liberal internationalism as well as tough stances against China and Russia. The Democratic Party is generally associated with more progressive policies. It supports social and economic equality, favoring greater government intervention in the economy but opposing government involvement in the private non-economic affairs of citizens. Democrats advocate for the civil rights of minorities, and they support a safety net for individuals, backing various social welfare programs, including Medicaid and food stamps. To fund these programs and other initiatives, Democrats often endorse a progressive tax. In addition, Democrats support environmental protection programs, gun control, less strict immigration laws, and worker rights. The idea of using colors to denote political parties was popularized by TV news broadcasts, which used color-coded maps during presidential elections. However, there was no uniformity in color choices, with different media outlets using different colors. Some followed the British tradition of using blue for conservatives, Republicans, and red for liberals, Democrats. However, during the 2000 U.S. presidential election and the lengthy battle to determine the winner, prominent news sources denoted Republicans as red and Democrats as blue, and these associations have persisted. Democrats are generally considered liberal, while Republicans are seen as conservative. The Democratic Party typically supports a larger government role in economic issues, backing regulations and social welfare programs. The Republicans, however, typically want a smaller government that is less involved in the economy. This contrary view on the size of government is reflected in their positions on taxes. Democrats favor a progressive tax to finance government's expanded role, while Republicans support lower taxes for all. However, Republicans do support a large budget for the military, and they often aggressively pursue U.S. national security interests, even if that means acting unilaterally. Democrats, however, prefer multilateralism. On social issues, Democrats seek greater freedoms, while Republicans follow more traditional values, supporting government intervention in such matters. For example, Democrats generally back abortion rights, while Republicans don't. In terms of geography, Democrats typically dominate in large cities, while Republicans are especially popular in rural areas. Democratic Party, in the United States, one of the two major political parties, the other being the Republican Party. The Democratic Party has changed significantly during its more than 2 centuries of existence. During the 19th century, the party supported or tolerated slavery, and it opposed civil rights reforms after the American Civil War in order to retain the support of Southern voters. By the mid-20th century, it had undergone a dramatic ideological realignment and reinvented itself as a party supporting organized labor, the civil rights of minorities, and progressive reform. Since Pres. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal of the 1930s, the party has also tended to favor greater government intervention in the economy and to oppose government intervention in the private non-economic affairs of citizens. The logo of the Democratic Party, the donkey, was popularized by cartoonist Thomas Nast in the 1870s, though widely used, it has never been officially adopted by the party. The Democratic Party is the oldest political party in the United States and among the oldest political parties in the world. It traces its roots to 1792, when followers of Thomas Jefferson adopted the name Republican to emphasize their anti-monarchical views. The Republican Party, also known as the Jeffersonian Republicans, advocated a decentralized government with limited powers. Another faction to emerge in the early years of the Republic, the Federalist Party, led by Alexander Hamilton, favored a strong central government. Jefferson's faction developed from the group of anti-federalists who had agitated in favor of the addition of a Bill of Rights to the Constitution of the United States. The Federalists called Jefferson's faction the Democratic-Republican Party in an attempt to identify it with the disorder spawned by the radical Democrats of the French Revolution of 1789. After the Federalist John Adams was elected president in 1796, the Republican Party served as the country's first opposition party, and in 1798 the Republicans adopted the derisive Democratic-Republican label as their official name. In 1800 Adams was defeated by Jefferson, whose victory ushered in a period of prolonged Democratic-Republican dominance. Jefferson won re-election easily in 1804, and Democratic-Republicans James Madison, 1808 and 1812, and James Monroe, 1816 and 1820, were also subsequently elected. By 1820 the Federalist Party had faded from national politics, leaving the Democratic Republicans as the country's sole major party and allowing Monroe to run unopposed in that year's presidential election. During the 1820s new states entered the Union, voting laws were relaxed, and several states passed legislation that provided for the direct election of presidential electors by voters. Electors had previously been appointed by state legislatures. These changes split the Democratic Republicans into factions, each of which nominated its own candidate in the presidential election of 1824. The party's congressional caucus nominated William H. Crawford of Georgia, but Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams, the leaders of the party's two largest factions, also sought the presidency. Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, was nominated by the Kentucky and Tennessee legislatures. Jackson won the most popular and electoral votes, but no candidate received the necessary majority in the Electoral College. When the election went to the House of Representatives, as stipulated in the Constitution, Clay, who had finished fourth and was thus eliminated from consideration through his support to Adams, who won the House vote and subsequently appointed Clay Secretary of State. Despite Adams's victory, differences between the Adams and the Jackson factions persisted. Adams's supporters, representing Eastern interests, called themselves the National Republicans. Jackson, whose strength lay in the South and West, referred to his followers simply as Democrats, or as Jacksonian Democrats. Jackson defeated Adams in the 1828 presidential election. In 1832 in Baltimore, Maryland, at one of the country's first national political conventions, the first convention had been held the previous year by the anti-Masonic movement, the Democrats nominated Jackson for president, drafted a party platform, and established a rule that required party presidential and vice presidential nominees to receive the votes of at least two-thirds of the National Convention delegates. This rule, which was not repealed until 1936, effectively ceded veto power in the selection process to minority factions, and it often required conventions to hold dozens of ballots to determine a presidential nominee. The party's presidential candidate in 1924, John W. Davis, needed more than 100 ballots to secure the nomination. Jackson easily won re-election in 1832, but his various opponents who derisively referred to him as King Andrew joined with former National Republicans to form the Whig Party, named for the English political faction that had opposed absolute monarchy in the 17th century, see Whig and Tory. From 1828 to 1856 the Democrats won all but two presidential elections, 1840 and 1848. During the 1840s and 50s, however, the Democratic Party, as it officially named itself in 1844, suffered serious internal strains over the issue of extending slavery to the Western territories. Southern Democrats, led by Jefferson Davis, wanted to allow slavery in all the territories, while Northern Democrats, led by Stephen A. Douglas, proposed that each territory should decide the question for itself through referendum. The issue split the Democrats at their 1860 presidential convention, where Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge and Northern Democrats nominated Douglas. The 1860 election also included John Bell, the nominee of the Constitutional Union Party, and Abraham Lincoln, the candidate of the newly established, 1854, anti-slavery Republican Party, which was unrelated to Jefferson's Republican Party of decades earlier. With the Democrats hopelessly split, Lincoln was elected president with only about 40% of the national vote. In contrast, Douglas and Breckinridge won 29% and 18% of the vote, respectively. The election of 1860 is regarded by most political observers as the first of the country's three critical elections contests that produced sharp yet enduring changes in party loyalties across the country. Some scholars also identify the 1824 election as a critical election. It established the Democratic and Republican parties as the major parties in what was ostensibly a two-party system. In federal elections from the 1870s to the 1890s, the parties were in rough balance except in the South, where the Democrats dominated because most whites blamed the Republican Party for both the American Civil War, 1861-65, and the Reconstruction, 1865-77, that followed. The two parties controlled Congress for almost equal periods through the rest of the 19th century, though the Democratic Party held the presidency only during the two terms of Grover Cleveland, 1885-89 and 1893-97. Repressive legislation and physical intimidation designed to prevent newly enfranchised African Americans from voting despite passage of the 15th Amendment ensured that the South would remain staunchly Democratic for nearly a century, see Black Code. During Cleveland's second term, however, the United States sank into an economic depression. The party at this time was basically conservative and agrarian-oriented, opposing the interests of big business, especially protective tariffs, and favoring cheap money policies, which were aimed at maintaining low interest rates. In the country's second critical election, in 1896, the Democrats split disastrously over the free silver and populist program of their presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan. Bryan lost by a wide margin to Republican William McKinley, a conservative who supported high tariffs and money based only on gold. From 1896 to 1932 the Democrats held the presidency only during the two terms of Woodrow Wilson, 1913 to 21, and even Wilson's presidency was considered somewhat of a fluke. Wilson won in 1912 because the Republican vote was divided between President William Howard Taft, the official party nominee, and former Republican President Theodore Roosevelt, the candidate of the new Bull Moose Party. Wilson championed various progressive economic reforms, including the breaking up of business monopolies and broader federal regulation of banking and industry. Although he led the United States into World War I to make the world safe for democracy, Wilson's brand of idealism and internationalism proved less attractive to voters during the spectacular prosperity of the 1920s than the Republicans' frank embrace of big business. The Democrats lost decisively the presidential elections of 1920, 1924, and 1928. The country's third critical election, in 1932, took place in the wake of the stock market crash of 1929 and in the midst of the Great Depression. Led by Franklin D. Roosevelt, the Democrats not only regained the presidency but also replaced the Republicans as the majority party throughout the country in the North as well as the South. Through his political skills and his sweeping New Deal social programs, such as Social Security and the statutory minimum wage, Roosevelt forged a broad coalition including small farmers, northern city dwellers, organized labor, European immigrants, liberals, intellectuals, and reformers that enabled the Democratic Party to retain the presidency until 1952 and to control both houses of Congress for most of the period from the 1930s to the mid-1990s. Roosevelt was re-elected in 1936, 1940, and 1944. He was the only president to be elected to more than 2 terms. Upon his death in 1945 he was succeeded by his vice president, Harry S. Truman, who was narrowly elected in 1948. Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander during World War II, won overwhelming victories against Democrat Adlai E. Stevenson in the presidential elections of 1952 and 1956. The Democrats regained the White House in the election of 1960, when John F. Kennedy narrowly defeated Eisenhower's vice president, Richard M. Nixon. The Democrats' championing of civil rights and racial desegregation under Truman, Kennedy, and especially Lyndon B. Johnson, who secured passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, cost the party the traditional allegiance of many of its Southern supporters. Moreover, the pursuit of civil rights legislation dramatically split the party's legislators along regional lines in the 1950s and 60s, with Southern senators famously conducting a protracted filibuster in an ultimately futile attempt to block passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Although Johnson defeated Republican Barry M. Goldwater by a landslide in 1964, his national support waned because of bitter opposition to the Vietnam War, and he chose not to run for re-election. Following the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy in 1968, the party nominated Johnson's vice president, Hubert H. Humphrey, at a fractious convention in Chicago that was marred by violence outside the hall between police and protesters. Meanwhile, many Southern Democrats supported the candidacy of Alabama Governor George C. Wallace, an opponent of federally mandated racial integration. In the 1968 election, Humphrey was soundly defeated by Nixon in the Electoral College. Among Southern states, Humphrey carried only Texas, though he lost the popular vote by only a narrow margin. From 1972 to 1988, the Democrats lost 4 of 5 presidential elections. In 1972, the party nominated anti-war candidate George S. McGovern, who lost to Nixon in one of the biggest landslides in U.S. electoral history. 2 years later, the Watergate scandal forced Nixon's resignation, enabling Jimmy Carter, then the Democratic governor of Georgia, to defeat Gerald R. Ford, Nixon's successor, in 1976. Although Carter orchestrated the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel, his presidency was plagued by a sluggish economy and by the crisis over the kidnapping and prolonged captivity of U.S. diplomats in Iran following the Islamic Revolution there in 1979. Carter was defeated in 1980 by conservative Republican Ronald W. Reagan, who was easily re-elected in 1984 against Carter's vice president, Walter F. Mondale. Mondale's running mate, Geraldine A. Ferraro, was the first female candidate on a major party ticket. Reagan's vice president, George Bush, defeated Massachusetts Governor Michael S. Dukakis in 1988. Despite its losses in the presidential elections of the 1970s and 80s, the Democratic Party continued to control both houses of Congress for most of the period, although the Republicans controlled the Senate from 1981 to 1987. In 1992, Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton recaptured the White House for the Democrats by defeating Bush and third-party candidate Ross Perot. Clinton's support of international trade agreements, example the North American Free Trade Agreement, and his willingness to cut spending on social programs to reduce budget deficits alienated the left wing of his party and many traditional supporters in organized labor. In 1994, the Democrats lost control of both houses of Congress, in part because of public disenchantment with Clinton's health care plan. During Clinton's second term, the country experienced a period of prosperity not seen since the 1920s, but a scandal involving Clinton's relationship with the White House in turn led to his impeachment by the House of Representatives in 1998. He was acquitted by the Senate in 1999. Al Gore, Clinton's vice president, easily won the Democratic presidential nomination in 2000. In the general election, Gore won 500,000 more popular votes than Republican George W. Bush but narrowly lost in the Electoral College after the Supreme Court of the United States ordered a halt to the manual recounting of disputed ballots in Florida. The party's nominee in 2004, John Kerry, was narrowly defeated by Bush in the popular and electoral vote. Aided by the growing opposition to the Iraq War, 2003-11, the Democrats regained control of the Senate and the House following the 2006 midterm elections. This marked the first time in some 12 years that the Democrats held a majority in both houses of Congress. In the general election of 2008, the party's presidential nominee, Barack Obama, defeated Republican John McCain, thereby becoming the first African American to be elected President of the United States. The Democrats also increased their majority in the Senate and the House. The party scored another victory in mid-2009, when an 8-month legal battle over one of Minnesota's Senate seats concluded with the election of Al Franken, a member of the state's Democratic Farmer Labor Party. With Franken in office, Democrats in the Senate, supported by the chamber's 2 independents, would be able to exercise a filibuster-proof 60-40 majority. In January 2010, the Democrats lost this filibuster-proof majority when the Democratic candidate lost the special election to fill the unexpired term of Ted Kennedy following his death. The Democrats' dominance of Congress proved short-lived, as a swing of some 60 seats, the largest since 1948, returned control of the House to the Republicans in the 2010 midterm election. The Democrats held on to their majority in the Senate, though that majority also was dramatically reduced. Many of the Democrats who had come into office in the 2006 and 2010 elections were defeated, but so too were a number of longtime office holders. Incumbents felt the sting of an electorate that was anxious about the struggling economy and high unemployment. The election also was widely seen as a referendum on the policies of the Obama administration, which were vehemently opposed by a populist upsurge in and around the Republican Party known as the Tea Party movement. The Democratic Party fared better in the 2012 general election, with Obama defeating his Republican opponent, Mitt Romney. The 2012 election did not significantly change the distribution of power between the 2 main parties in Congress. While the Democrats retained their majority in the Senate, they were unable to retake the House of Representatives. The Republicans retook the Senate during the 2014 midterm elections. In the 2016 presidential race, Democrats selected Hillary Clinton as their nominee, the first time a major party in the United States had a woman at the top of its presidential ticket. Despite winning the popular vote by almost 3 million ballots, Clinton failed to take enough states in the Electoral College, and the presidency was won by Republican Donald J. Trump in one of the largest upsets in U.S. electoral history. Moreover, the Republican Party maintained control of both chambers of Congress in the 2016 election. In the midterms 2 years later, however, Democrats retook the House in what some described as a blue wave. Despite being conducted during the coronavirus global pandemic, the 2020 federal election generated the largest voter turnout in American history, with more 150 million ballots cast. Democrats who voted early and by mail more often than Republicans did handed Obama's former vice president, Joe Biden, a victory over the incumbent, Trump, in the presidential election. Biden won the popular vote by some 5 million votes and triumphed in the Electoral College vote by holding on to the states captured by Clinton in the previous presidential contest and winning back the blue wall states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin that had been lost to Trump in 2016. The Democrats' attempt to retake control of the Senate hinged on 2 runoff elections to be held in Georgia in January 2021. The party held on to control of the House of Representatives, but its majority shrank significantly. Despite tracing its roots to Thomas Jefferson, who advocated a less powerful, more decentralized federal government, the modern Democratic Party generally supports a strong federal government with powers to regulate business and industry in the public interest, federally financed social services and benefits for the poor, the unemployed, the aged, and other groups, and the protection of civil rights. Most Democrats also endorse a strong separation of church and state, and they generally oppose government regulation of the private, non-economic lives of citizens. Regarding foreign policy, Democrats tend to prefer internationalism and multilateralism, i.e., the execution of foreign policy through international institutions such as the United Nations over isolationism and unilateralism. However, because the party is highly decentralized, as is the Republican Party, it encompasses a wide variety of opinion on certain issues. Although most Democrats favor affirmative action and gun control, for example, some moderate and conservative Democrats oppose those policies or give them only qualified support. Both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party formulate their platforms quadrennially at national conventions, which are held to nominate the party's presidential candidates. The conventions take place in the summer of each presidential election year. By tradition, the incumbent party holds its convention second. The Democratic National Convention is typically attended by some 4,000 delegates, most of whom are selected during the preceding winter and spring. So-called superdelegates, which include members of the Democratic National Committee, the party's formal governing body, as well as Democratic governors and members of Congress, also participate. However, following criticism of the superdelegates' influence in the 2016 nomination process, their power was limited by rule changes in 2018. Notably, if the first ballot for the party's nominee is contested, superdelegates are unable to vote until the second round. Until the 1970s, few nationwide rules governed the selection of delegates to the Democratic National Convention. After the 1968 convention, during which Humphrey was able to secure the Democratic nomination without having won a single primary election or caucus, the party imposed strict rules requiring that states select delegates through primaries or caucuses and that delegates vote on the first ballot for the candidate to whom they are pledged, thus eliminating the direct election of candidates by the conventions. More than 40 states now select delegates to the Democratic Convention through primary elections. Virtually all Democratic primaries allocate delegates on a proportional basis, so that the proportion of delegates awarded to a candidate in a state is roughly the same as the proportion of the vote he receives in that state, provided that he receives at least 15%. In contrast, almost all Republican presidential primaries award all delegates to the candidate who receives the most votes. Thus, candidates running for the Democratic nomination tend to win at least some delegates in each primary, resulting generally in closer and longer nominating contests. Nevertheless, one candidate usually captures a majority of delegates before the summer nominating convention, leaving the convention simply to ratify the winner. In addition to confirming the party nominee and adopting the party platform, the National Convention formally chooses a national committee to organize the next convention and to govern the party until the next convention is held. The Democratic National Committee, DNC, consists of about 400 party leaders representing all U.S. states and territories. Its chairman is typically named by the party's presidential nominee and then formally elected by the committee. The DNC has little power, because it lacks direct authority over party members in Congress and even in the states. Democratic members of the House and the Senate organize themselves into party conferences that elect the party leaders of each chamber. In keeping with the decentralized nature of the party, each chamber also creates separate committees to raise and disperse funds for House and Senate election campaigns. In November 2020, Democrat Joe Biden won the 2020 presidential election. He began his term with extremely narrow Democratic majorities in the U.S. House and Senate. Biden enacted the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which is the largest allocation of funds for addressing climate change in the history of the United States to date. Biden also signed a major infrastructure bill with bipartisan support, the first federal gun safety legislation in 28 years, and appointed the most federal judges during the first 2 years of any presidency since John F. Kennedy. In 2022, Biden appointed Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first black woman on the Supreme Court. However, she was replacing liberal Justice Stephen Breyer, so she did not alter the court's 6-3 split between conservatives, the majority, and liberals. After Dobbs v. Jackson, decided June 24, 2022, which led to abortion bans in much of the country, the Democratic Party rallied behind abortion rights. In the 2022 midterm elections, Democrats dramatically outperformed historical trends, and a widely anticipated red wave did not materialize. The party only narrowly lost its majority in the U.S. House and expanded its majority in the U.S. Senate along with several gains at the state level, including acquiring trifectas, control of both legislative houses and governor's seat, in several states. During Joe Biden's presidency in the 2020s, the party has adopted an increasingly left-wing cultural and economic agenda. In 2024, Biden was the first incumbent president since Lyndon B. Johnson in 1968 to withdraw from a re-election race, the first since the 19th century to withdraw after serving only one term, and the only one ever to withdraw after already winning the primaries. As of 2024, Democrats hold the presidency and a majority in the U.S. Senate, as well as 23 state governorships, 19 state legislatures, 17 state government trifectas, and the mayorships in the majority of the country's major cities. 3 of the 9 current U.S. Supreme Court justices were appointed by Democratic presidents. By registered members, the Democratic Party is the largest party in the U.S. and the 4th largest in the world. Including the incumbent Biden, 16 Democrats have served as President of the United States. The Democratic-Republican Party splintered in 1824 into the short-lived National Republican Party and the Jacksonian movement, which in 1828 became the Democratic Party. Under the Jacksonian era, the term "the democracy" was in use by the party, but the name Democratic Party was eventually settled upon and became the official name in 1844. Members of the party are called Democrats or Dems. The most common mascot symbol for the party has been the donkey, or jackass. Andrew Jackson's enemies twisted his name to jackass as a term of ridicule regarding a stupid and stubborn animal. However, the Democrats liked the common man implications and picked it up too, therefore the image persisted and evolved. Its most lasting impression came from the cartoons of Thomas Nast from 1870 in Harper's Weekly. Cartoonists followed Nast and used the donkey to represent the Democrats and the elephant to represent the Republicans. In the early 20th century, the traditional symbol of the Democratic Party in Indiana, Kentucky, Oklahoma, and Ohio was the rooster, as opposed to the Republican eagle. The rooster was also adopted as an official symbol of the National Democratic Party. In 1904, the Alabama Democratic Party chose, as the logo to put on its ballots, a rooster with the motto "White Supremacy, for the Right." The words "white supremacy" were replaced with "Democrats" in 1966. In 1996, the Alabama Democratic Party dropped the rooster, citing racist and white supremacist connotations linked with the symbol. The rooster symbol still appears on Oklahoma, Kentucky, Indiana, and West Virginia ballots. In New York, the Democratic ballot symbol is a five-pointed star. Although both major political parties, and many minor ones, use the traditional American colors of red, white, and blue in their marketing and representations, since election night 2000 blue has become the identifying color for the Democratic Party while red has become the identifying color for the Republican Party. That night, for the first time all major broadcast television networks used the same color scheme for the electoral map: blue states for Al Gore, Democratic nominee, and red states for George W. Bush, Republican nominee. Since then, the color blue has been widely used by the media to represent the party. This is contrary to common practice outside of the United States, where blue is the traditional color of the right and red the color of the left. Jefferson Jackson Day is the annual fundraising event, dinner, held by Democratic Party organizations across the United States. It is named after Presidents Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, whom the party regards as its distinguished early leaders. The song "Happy Days Are Here Again" is the unofficial song of the Democratic Party. It was used prominently when Franklin D. Roosevelt was nominated for president at the 1932 Democratic National Convention and remains a sentimental favorite for Democrats. For example, Paul Schaefer played the theme on The Late Show with David Letterman after the Democrats won Congress in 2006. "Don't Stop" by Fleetwood Mac was adopted by Bill Clinton's presidential campaign in 1992 and has endured as a popular Democratic song. The emotionally similar song "Beautiful Day" by the band U2 has also become a favorite theme song for Democratic candidates. John Kerry used the song during his 2004 presidential campaign, and several Democratic congressional candidates used it as a celebratory tune in 2006. As a traditional anthem for its presidential nominating convention, Aaron Copland's "Fanfare for the Common Man" is traditionally performed at the beginning of the Democratic National Convention. Thank you for watching this video.